Good morning, everybody. Happy New Year. First grand rounds of the decade, right? Thank you all for coming. Why talk about crowding again? We've had a number of talks about emergency department crowding over the years, including Dr. Lipinski's talk in March 2018. I'm James Worrall. I think I know most people here. And as many of you know, I've been thinking about and working in crowding for some time now. And I wanted to look at this problem from a little bit of a different perspective. I'm indebted to many people who've shaped my thinking and many who are willing to be interviewed by me, and some of whom are here today. In terms of my objectives, they're pretty simple. We're not going to go over the input, throughput, output model. I think we've been through that a few times. We don't need to do that again. We're not going to find any villains to blame for crowding. And so my only real objective is for you to leave with one new idea or to be thinking about the problem a little bit differently. Patients seeking unscheduled care have been a problem for doctors and hospitals from the beginning, as this magazine cover from 1962 makes so clear. Patients kept turning up with problems. Hospitals needed to make space to deal with them. Doctors needed to see them, and that was really inconvenient. Patients were not making appointments, they were not arriving during business hours, and often they couldn't pay for their care, and sometimes they didn't even have emergencies, at least from the doctor's point of view. With the arrival of public Medicare in Canada, this became a political problem, and so when faced with long waits in the emergency departments, not enough doctors in the emerge, too much money being spent in the emerge, everybody knew who to blame: the patients. We've heard politicians saying that patients need to stop going to the emerge when they don't have true emergencies. We have seen editorials in newspapers saying the same thing, and hospitals telling the public to stop coming during flu season or when they're really crowded. Even our consultant colleagues are annoyed when their patients turn up in the emergency department expecting to see their specialist. Guys, why do people come to the emergency department? It's not complicated. You can just ask them, and a number of studies do just that. What do they find? Would you wait 9 hours to see a doctor if you didn't have a good reason? No, people come because they think it's an emergency, or it might be, or they think they need a test they can't get anywhere else, or they can't get into any primary care options, or the primary care is inconvenient or far away. So this author, like many others, have concluded that there's really no point telling patients that they didn't have an emergency. That's from our perspective. Ed, what's your favorite fast food restaurant? That's a safe space, Ed. You can tell us.
Well, usually it's end of shift. It's McDonald's.
Okay, McDonald's end of shift. So, Ed, could you imagine? It's a safe space. Ed, could you imagine you go into McDonald's and there's a long lineup and the manager comes out and says, "You people do not really need to eat here. You're not hungry." But we all know that patients come in for minor stuff, right? In fact, it's kind of a game. We sort of sit at the urgent care desk and we read the triage notes to each other and we roll our eyes. Well, I came in because my brother was here anyway and I thought I'd just get checked out. We hate it. It drives us nuts. The nurses hate it. And yet, the Canadian Institute for Health Information finds that only 16% of emergency department visits are for what are called family practice-sensitive conditions, or conditions that could probably easily be handled by a family doctor. One Ontario study looked at improving after-hours access to family health teams. And guess what? It didn't reduce emergency department visits. And Michael Scholl, with the Institute for Clinical and Evaluative Sciences, did a really innovative study where they looked at Ontario-wide data And they found that adding minor cases to the ED volume does not really change waiting times or length of stay for the more serious patients. And yet I still believe minor cases cause some harm, but the harm's to us, to the providers. So to me, it feels kind of like this. You're at home in your bathroom and the toilet is overflowing like crazy. And your kid comes up and says, "Dad, the Wi-Fi's down. You've got to fix it right now." And you're like, "I am up to my ankles in crap here. Go away." That's what it feels like. But minor cases do not contribute to emergency department crowding. They don't. And yet, just a year ago, an Ontario government spokesperson implied that patients going to the emergency department rather than to their family doctor is the root cause of hospital overcrowding. It's not. Now, you've probably heard that we do not have enough inpatient beds in this country. And there may be some truth to that. And some of you know that Al Drummond, who is a vocal spokesperson for the emergency medicine community, has been calling for more beds for some time. So I want to get into this a little bit. But first, this is an empty restaurant. Has anyone here ever worked in a restaurant? Lots of hands. Okay, I see George's hand going up. So George, you're the manager of this restaurant, and every evening you've got 3 servers working, okay? But you look at some data and you discover that on Tuesday evening, you got like less than 50% of the customers that you have on Friday evening, but you've still got those 3 servers. So what are you going to do? Adjust the schedule. So maybe you'll have 2 servers or maybe 1 server on Tuesdays. Like, it's just common sense, right? Well, if you apply the same logic to hospital managers, you'll see that they do exactly the same thing. It's important to understand the government does not tell the Ottawa Hospital how many beds to have open and staffed. We've got a global budget, and then each individual department gets their budget. So if you're my friend Kevin Peters, who's managing one of the surgical wards, maybe orthopedics, and you've got empty beds, well, you're not going to pay nurses to staff those empty beds, to look after nobody. You're going to adjust the schedule. And any short-term variation in demand is going to be handled by a buffer zone called the emergency department, right? So therefore, the wards are effectively full all the time. And that seems very efficient because you're not paying nurses to look after empty beds. So we're going to come back to this idea later. Just keep that in the back of your mind. But first, let's deal with some traffic problems. This is a picture of Katy Freeway in Houston, Texas, which is believed to be the widest freeway in North America. It's 26 lanes across. Now, between 2008 and 2011 in Houston, they paid $2.8 billion, that's US dollars, to expand the freeway to reduce traffic congestion. What do you think happened? Morning commute times increased by 30%. Evening commute times increased by 55%. It actually got worse, a lot worse. A 2009 economic analysis found that if a city builds, on average, 10% more roads, what happens is you get 10% more miles being driven in that city. And another study showed that within 3 years of building new road capacity, traffic basically fills up the new capacity. So this phenomenon is what economists call induced demand. If you build more roads, people change their behavior and drive more. Yeah, you live downtown, but you really feel like Swedish meatballs for lunch, so you're going to just pop on the Queensway and go out to IKEA. I mean, who wouldn't, right? So capacity influences behavior. Now, what about in the hospital? Do capacity constraints change our behavior? And I argue yes. So we've all had a case of somebody who's got maybe pneumonia and they're a little bit borderline in terms of whether they need admission or not. So what are you going to do? You're going to bring them in or send them home with antibiotics? Antibiotics work the same at home as in hospital, right? Your decision might be influenced by what you know about how many beds you have, how busy the emerge is, how full you are. Are you going to get that ultrasound now, or are you going to order it as an outpatient? Your patient's got gastro, are you going to put in an IV and keep them around for a few hours, or are you going to tell them to buy some Gravol and go home and drink Gatorade? You're going to consult somebody today, or maybe send them for an outpatient consult. You got 5 minutes on your shift to grab a coffee, but the lineup at Second Cup is looking pretty long. You might have to settle for Van Hoot. But in the emergency department, we're terribly short of space, so it makes sense to think we need more capacity, so maybe we could make a bigger emerge, open some extra stretchers. So this is a study from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where they did exactly that. They had a crowded ED, and so they enlarged it. And they reported on their experience, and they found everything got worse. Took longer to see patients, more boarding, increased left without being seen rate, decreased patient satisfaction. And then they said, well, that didn't work. Let's do something different. Let's open a rapid assessment unit. And they were able to improve some things. So they concluded flow was better than capacity. Here's another study based on some mathematical modeling. So what this group did was they modeled the effects of adding beds to the emerge or just moving admitted patients out of the emerge more efficiently. And what they find? Well, you won't be surprised to learn that if you had more beds, length of stay went up. But if you improved flow to the wards, length of stay got lower. And those results were consistent even as they modeled increased emergency department volumes. So the evidence for expanding the emerge does not look very good. Or, as our fearless leader likes to put it, the solution to constipation is not to enlarge the colon. You can't make this stuff up. Oh, what's happened? I touch. Guy, how powerful are you? And of course the tech guy left. Oh, there we go. You know what? I think I disrupted its force field or something. Okay, so what's really going on here is when we add capacity, it helps, and sometimes we need to do that, but invariably it also decreases the pressure that is essential to improve flow. So let me ask you this. Is there any reason to believe that the principle is not the same for inpatient beds? If we add beds, won't inpatient flow get worse? In Canadian healthcare, we constantly face situations where the demand for our services exceeds our capacity, at least at times. And we invariably complain that we need more capacity. We need more doctors, we need more nurses, we need more hospitals, more beds, more nursing homes, more money. But there is another option, which is to improve flow. Because improving flow actually creates virtual capacity. You can move more patients through. But nobody ever believes it's possible that they're not using their existing resources as optimally as they could be. And obviously change is hard, so flow improvements are hard to effect, and they can be uncomfortable. So one description of this relationship is that flow and capacity are inversely related to each other. Well, that's probably too simple. And I realize that once you factor in the phase of the moon, the X-ray turnaround time, the number of consultants cubed, whether or not you have a C. diff outbreak, you realize it's a much more complicated relationship. And there was one Australian study that looked at how flow changed in a group of hospitals as capacity changed. And they identified several so-called choke points. The study is very interesting because it does show a relationship between capacity and flow, which is what we're talking about. So at 91% occupancy, the emergency department started to get more crowded. But admissions and discharges also increased. At 96% capacity, the hospital became more efficient at discharging patients, like shorter lengths of stay. But the emerge was getting tighter and tighter. And once they got to 99%, things tended to spiral out of control because there were, at that point, fewer discharges than admissions. But there are some caveats because this is all observational data, so it does not tell us the direction of causality. It's possible that when you got to 99%, flow started to deteriorate, or it's possible that you got to 99% because flow had started to deteriorate. But I think the interesting idea suggested by this data is that at certain levels of hospital crowding, you start to compromise flow. So this is likely because the staff become overwhelmed putting out flyers and just doing basic care, and you start to overwhelm your support services like labs and imaging. It also shows that higher occupancy is associated with improved inpatient efficiency, but at the cost of emergency department crowding. So this sort of makes me think about the Starling curve, which you may dimly remember from medical school. This is that as end diastolic volume goes up, cardiac contractility goes up to a point. And then the heart becomes overwhelmed and contractility starts to go down. So maybe it's the same relationship between occupancy and flow. As occupancy goes up, flow will improve, but only to a point. In any case, there's a clear tension between flow and capacity. If you improve flow, you create virtual capacity. But extra capacity destroys flow. So there's always a push and a pull between the two. And the obvious question that comes out of this is, given that our emergency departments and our hospitals are so crowded, do we need to improve capacity or do we need to improve flow? And clearly the two are intertwined. You obviously can't say you don't need any capacity. So the answer, I think, depends a lot on the time scale of care. So here you have a virtual journey for a patient through the system, starting with the ambulance and moving to the emerge where the doctor's hair's on fire and carrying on. The further to the left you are, the shorter the time scale of care. And flow is much more important. But as you move to the right, the time scale of care is not minutes or hours, but rather days or weeks or even months. So their capacity becomes more important. Now, the two are important all at every point, but on the left side of the diagram, flow is king. And certainly in the emergency department, flow is far more important than capacity. And I would argue even in the inpatient world, flow is more important than capacity. Now, does anybody recognize this image? Napster, all right. I thought that nobody born after 1990 would be able to catch the reference. So this is Napster. Does anyone remember Napster? Yeah? I see some hands going up. Okay. So Napster was the first widespread file sharing service, and it allowed users to share their MP3 files of their music. It was free to download and easy to use. It launched in 1999, and it really caught on. By 2001, they had 60 million users. Ultimately, it got shut down by lawsuits and so forth, but other similar services popped up, and the death spiral of the record industry began. Now, you don't need to be a genius to see why this was so popular, right? Why would you pay $20 for a CD when you could listen to it for free? And, of course, there were maybe some ethical issues there. It sort of maybe was stealing the music from the artists and the record companies. But these 60 million people using Napster, I don't think they would have gone into a record store and grabbed a CD and made a run for it, right? So even if it was stealing, it really didn't feel like stealing. And there wasn't any risk. You weren't going to go to jail. Maybe the guys who started Napster were going to go to jail. The users faced almost no risk. So this is an example of something called moral hazard. Moral hazard is a term in economics. It means when your behavior is divorced from the consequences of the behavior or the risk that you incur. And a really well-known example is the subprime mortgage crisis of 2007 and 8. So what happened there was, in the States, principally, you had mortgage brokers, people who were working on commission, and they were selling mortgages to riskier clients, sort of like what they call subprime clients, you know? They weren't selling to the radiologists. And the banks who were endorsing these mortgages, they weren't keeping the mortgage on their balance sheets. What they would do is they would bundle the mortgages together and they would sell the debt onto bigger investors like pension funds and so forth. And so the brokers and the banks got a small profit, but the third party, they didn't really understand the risk they were incurring. So the brokers made the profit, but their behavior was separated from the risk, and that's what caused the crisis, essentially. Because when these people started defaulting on the mortgages, everything unraveled. And that's what caused the global financial crisis, wrecked the global financial system, and had widespread implications for average people. In the United States, the median family's net worth dropped by about 40% because of this. So moral hazard is very powerful. Now, to understand how moral hazard affects us in healthcare, you really got to think about these transitions in care between the ambulance and the emergency department, between the emerge and the inpatient units and so forth, and between the inpatients and post-acute care. Post-acute care means nursing homes, rehab hospitals, home care, convalescent care, all the kinds of care people often need after their acute medical stay. So let's consider a rehab hospital, okay? If the rehab hospital has a big waiting list to get in, a big queue, what could they do? Well, the first thing they could do is complain about not enough resources, right? That's probably what they would do. But they could also look at their processes and find efficiencies. They could manage more patients at once. But that sounds like a lot of work, doesn't it? Like, that's hard. And why bother, really? Because the risk or the harm is all to the patients who are waiting. And they're in some other hospital. They're not at the rehab hospital. There's no consequences to just doing things the way they always have, and that's moral hazard. When the person whose actions are important or essential is separated from the risk of not acting, that's moral hazard. So you all probably know that the hospital has been pushing for years to try and improve the number of morning discharges that we have, right? Let's get these patients out by 11 so that we can move our admitted patients up from the ED. And we also know that there's a lot of barriers and obstacles that explain why that doesn't always happen. But if you're working on the ward, whether you're a doctor or a nurse or whoever, and you succeed, you successfully get that patient out by 11 o'clock. Do you know what you get? Is it A, a free pizza lunch, B, a personal letter of thanks from Jack Kitts, C, you get to go home early with full pay, or D, you get another sicker patient? Yeah, it's obvious, right? It's D. So there's obvious moral hazard here. Now, I don't blame the nurse or the doctor or the ward clerk or anybody, but this is part of the reason why patients cannot move to the next step in care. And what do we call that? Access block. I thought this picture of my son was so funny, I had to find a way to work it in somehow. So when this guy's blocking access, you're not getting anywhere. Okay. So now we're going to talk about access block behavior. And what do I mean by that? So first of all, I've talked to people all over the hospital, and everyone I talk to in healthcare works extremely hard, does their best for patients, motivated, conscientious. I'm not talking about people making a conscious decision to go slowly or not work on flow. Rather, I'm talking about the behavior of a system in response to the incentives that are in place. So it's the sum total of all the little decisions that get made, the choices, the priorities, the things you did, the things you didn't do or did later, the motivations of the many people who contribute to flow within a hospital. So to discharge an inpatient, lots of little things need to happen, right? So somebody's got to put in the oxygen request, someone else has got to organize home care, somebody's got to book the transport service, some resident's got to write a prescription, the follow-up's got to get organized, somebody's got to dress the wounds, someone's got to pack up all the patient's belongings, someone's got to remember to call the family and tell them to come pick up the patient, someone's got to write an order, we've got to make sure the pick line gets in, and like a bunch of other stuff I don't even know about because I don't work in the inpatient world anymore. And who's motivated to ensure all of these different things happen? Who's thinking ahead and planning to make sure that they do? And who's studying the process to see which things are constantly going wrong? Nobody, right? In access block behavior's way, we have scenes like this. But make no mistake, we practice access block behavior in the emergency department as well. So I'm going to tell you a true story from a few years ago. As many of you know, we've been working hard to try and get patients off cardiac monitors, right? Get that patient off the monitor so we can bring the next one in. So on a particular busy day, one of the physicians in our group asked to have a chest pain patient taken off the monitor because we had this lineup of ambulances. And the nurse said no. The nurse said, look, I've got 3 really sick patients. And if I take this person off the monitor, I'm going to get another sick patient from the runway, and then I'll have 5 instead of 4. This is an experienced nurse, a good nurse. Now, it's kind of an egregious or an obvious example, but I believe we engage in more subtle kinds of access block behavior every day. Sometimes we have a patient who could be discharged, but we decide to go see somebody else first. Or we review a case with the learner first. Or we grab a coffee first. Same with the nurses. It doesn't have to be a conscious thing. It's a natural way people respond to the incentives in the system. How are some ways we subtly block access in the emerge? Well, we keep people in the waiting room. Out of sight, we don't need to see them. We keep them on the runway. We keep them in the offload area instead of providing them with proper nursing care. We keep patients on monitors for their safety when other patients are waiting and getting no care at all. Some people argue that fixed physician shift start times are a kind of access block behavior because they exist for our convenience, not for the patients. And other people argue that physician payment models contribute to access block because if you're getting a fixed hourly wage, as most emergency physicians in Ontario do under alternative funding plans, we lose incentives for forward flow and productivity. This is all controversial, but I want to share with you a quote from a recent CGEM debate series where they were debating the merits of assessing patients in unconventional spaces. So here's the quote. While reviewing a local emergency department, our group walked along a hallway where a dozen EMS crews were parked with their patients, then through a packed waiting room, seeing several patients in distress. We proceeded inside triage, where I overheard one physician say to another, I'm going home early. There are no patients to see. We always complain about the inpatient wards not moving their admitted patients up quickly enough, but this is exactly the same thing we do to the paramedics. Of course, we're all aware that access block for inpatient services exists as well. They're trying to get their patients out to home care and nursing homes and whatnot. So at every step in the process, we have access block. And the person or the institution that can provide what the patient needs seemingly bears no responsibility for the patients who are waiting at the preceding step. This is moral hazard in action, and it represents the huge accountability failures that exist throughout our system. Okay, so just to take a quick break from crowding and lighten the tone for a moment, I want to get back to Napster here. So it got shut down. But one company benefited a lot, and that company was Apple. Because in 2001, they released the iPod. And they actually didn't anticipate selling that many iPods. But it turned out to be a perfect companion for all these illegally downloaded MP3s. So sales exploded. Their stock price quadrupled over the next 3 years. And they thought, this is great. Let's invest more in mobile. And they came out with the iPhone in 2007. Now, as we all know, that started the smartphone revolution. People loved it. And now, approximately 3 billion people worldwide own a smartphone. 3 billion people have a smartphone. And the rise of the smartphone led to an explosion in the use of social media, in particular Twitter. And you probably know that Twitter played an important role in the Arab Spring of 2011. But unfortunately, Twitter also allowed this guy to gain a huge following by saying outrageous things and ultimately become president of the United States. So in summary, Eric, why didn't you pay a few bucks for that Eminem album back in 2000? Okay. Emergency medicine as a specialty really got its start in the United States, and ASEP was founded in 1968, but it spread very quickly to Canada. And the model of emergency care that we have is also spread to other English-speaking countries like the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and with some variation to lots of countries around the world. But interestingly, some countries actually have a different model. And I think it's important to think about this because it helps us to understand why crowding is so intractable. So let's talk about the North American model, as I call it. The first feature of this model is that the emergency department is a centralized location for unscheduled care. I'm not talking about coughs and colds. I'm talking about sick patients, so complications of surgery, complications of patients with chemotherapy treatment, worsening heart failure, anybody with chronic illness. In fact, most specialized services in our system are so busy, they've delegated all their unscheduled care to us. The second feature of the North American model is that most diagnostic clarification has to happen in the ED. There's no a priori reason why that should be. Sometimes you know very well from the moment you see the patient, they're not going home. The third feature of the North American model is that the hospitals operate at full capacity most of the time. They don't keep empty beds available. Rather, the emergency department is the buffer. And the fourth feature of this model is we have no control over movement of the patients to the wards. And we have this moral hazard problem. Now, let me ask you this. If you wanted to design a system to maximize emergency department crowding, could you think of something more effective at doing it than the model we have? ED crowding is not because we don't have enough beds. Or certainly that's not the primary reason. It's not because of ALC patients. It's not because too many people have the flu. It's not because consultants are lazy. It's because the system is producing exactly the output we should expect of it. What about other countries? Well, some of them have different models for unscheduled care. The whole concept of what an emergency department is and what it's for and who goes there is a little different. And there's no clear relationship between the number of inpatient beds per capita and how much crowding they have. Denmark and Sweden, for an example, have models that are quite different. They have robust primary care systems. They have ways of 80% of patients in Denmark get admitted directly to the floor. They don't need to go to the emerge. Meanwhile, Australia and Italy have systems that are more like ours. And despite the fact they have more per capita beds, they have huge crowding problems. And Australia also has a parallel private system. And that's not helping. So we can't just tear up the system we have and start over. And there are some great things about our system. The North American model created the need for the specialty of emergency medicine. And that means that most patients who have a true life-threatening emergency can have rapid access to a physician who is an expert at dealing with emergencies. That is an incredible accomplishment. But this model also promotes crowding. And the question is, do we just accept that? Do we live with it? Well, there's a small problem with that, and that's that crowding kills people. Crowding is associated with increased mortality. So how do we take the model we have and we make it work better? So after careful research, I have determined that the solution to ED crowding is work harder, Joe. Is Joe even here? Joe's not here. Okay. So if everyone just worked a little harder, we would all be okay. In particular, Joe, he could really solve this for us. So I'm kidding, of course. The reason I put this slide up is that Joe once said something to me that really stuck with me. Okay? So this was a number of years ago, and we just received one of these messages telling us that we all needed to see more patients faster, while at the same time doing a better job of teaching, and we all needed to be more compassionate and provide a better patient experience, and also not forget to do our billing. So Joe and I were chatting about this in the office, and he said something which, like, it's so obvious, and yet it seems so wise. He said, I think when I'm on shift, I'm working about as hard as I possibly can. And yet when we talk about crowding, we have meetings with other departments, meet with the hospital. Often the conclusion we come to is we need to do better. So that's insane. To me, that's like a hockey coach saying, we need to win more. Well, obviously, yeah, that's the goal, but you can't just try harder and expect that to happen. So I reject any solution to this problem that is based around simply trying harder. If working harder isn't going to work, and just adding beds isn't going to work any better than widening the freeway in Houston worked, we're going to need to change the rules by which our system operates. So let's talk about some ideas about how to do that. So in 2004, the government in the UK announced that 98% of patients needed to be discharged, seen and discharged within 4 hours from their emerge, or as they call them, the A&Es. That sounds impossible. And yet, they did it. The target was met nationally in 2005 and 2006. They did do a few things that incentivize people to work hard on this problem. First of all, hospitals that didn't meet the target could be fined, or they would just fire the CEO. I love the British. That's so... Yeah, you don't think you can do it? Okay, you're out. We'll find someone else who can do that. They did increase funding to make it happen, and they also created something to assist with this process called medical assessment units. So what's a medical assessment unit? Well, in Canada, when you go to the emergency department, basically one of two things is going to happen ultimately. You're going to go home, or you're going to get admitted, unless you die, which hopefully is not what's going to happen. But in the UK, they had this other option, which was you could go to the medical assessment unit, and you could stay there for up to 12 hours. They'd possibly do further testing if necessary, and from there you'd go home or get admitted. Now, you may be thinking, like, how is that any different? That's just like putting the patient in OBS and doing it there. And yet, it did make a difference. So the pros of this is that this medical assessment unit, it's not the emerge, it's somewhere else, right? So the patient is out of the ED. The ED has the capacity to accept new or sicker patients. There's a transfer of accountability, so now the consultants are responsible for flow. But there's some potential downsides as well. You're creating an extra transition point in care, and whenever you create such a transition point, you've got an opportunity for an extra layer of access block. And what do you do when the medical assessment unit is full? Well, I'm not sure. Probably depends on the institution. And sometimes physicians were rushed to make their disposition decisions because they're under such pressure to meet this target. So it was very controversial, but it made a huge difference. What happened? Well, in 2010, they decided to drop the target from 98% to 95%. And there was an immediate decline in performance. Immediate. And now they're talking about scrapping it altogether. The reason for that is that under the David Cameron government, there were a lot of austerity measures, budget cuts, and hospitals began to struggle to meet the target more and more. Plus, like us, they had an aging population. So people are talking about scrapping it and replacing it with something totally different. The Royal College of Emergency Medicine does not support that. For all the problems and the faults and the limitations of the 4-hour rule, they recognize that this has profoundly changed the way emergency care is delivered in the UK. Meanwhile, Australia and New Zealand have adopted similar targets. And they've actually published some studies showing that these targets are associated with reduced mortality, which is not surprising because we know that crowding increases mortality. So the lessons learned, targets matter. These targets matter. And with political will and organizational accountability, you can reorganize your processes of care to improve ED flow. Now, another idea that's often discussed is the Viccellio protocol. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this. The idea here is that when the emerge is crowded with boarded patients, you move them to the hallways upstairs. You share the load, right? And the theory is that by putting these patients in the hallway, you actually motivate the inpatient staff to sort of mobilize resources and get their discharges done, and the patients don't stay in the hallway very long. So Grant Innes, who's a big proponent of this, says this is an accountability strategy. We're making the inpatient services accountable for their patients that are waiting in the emerge. But does it work? So what's the evidence? So Dr. Innes and the group from Alberta, where they adopted a province-wide overcapacity protocol, presented some data at SAME that showed that it significantly decreased ED length of stay, it reduced the number of admitted patients in the morning, it improved PIA time, and so forth. So it did seem to work. Unfortunately, they didn't publish this data in a journal. It was just presented in abstract form, and there's not a lot of high-quality evidence out there. I think this idea was an early win, but I'm skeptical it's going to solve all of our problems in 2020. Almost all hospitals in Ontario now do put patients in inpatient hallways. And I can see how this motivates people to change their behavior if it's an occasional thing that people respond to because it's so different. But if you're doing it on a daily basis, it just becomes the routine. So don't you just fall back into the same patterns of behavior? It's also challenging to find patients who can be in the hallway. You know, people need oxygen, they need suction, they need isolation, they need a bathroom. There's a lot of obstacles. So the most I think we can say is that the Viccellio protocol is part of the solution, but we need other ideas. Now, North York General is a really busy tertiary care hospital in Toronto. They see 114,000 patients a year in their emerge, which is more than either of our campuses. And they are the number one in Ontario on the pay for results metrics. So I spoke a couple of years ago to their CEO at the time, Tim Rutledge, who of course is an emergency physician. And I said, well, how do you do it? Like, what's the secret? And he couldn't tell me really a secret. He said, the only magic bullet is changing the culture. You've got to get people together. You've got to develop a vision of a better hospital. You've got to see it from the perspective of the patients. And you have to continuously work at making small improvements to the whole arc of care. So that sounds sort of like motherhood and apple pie, right? Does it really work? Well, let's look at their P4R numbers for October. At the 90th percentile, admitted patients stay in their emerge for 13.4 hours, while here at the Civic, 22.6. The General's just a shade better. Their PIA time at the 90th percentile, 4.2, and we're up around 6 hours. So they must be doing something right. He told me that the culture in their hospital is that if you got a cardiology patient in the emerge, admitted, the inpatient doctors and nurses consider it their responsibility to get that person out of the emerge and up to their unit so they can look after them. Same with orthopedics or oncology or whoever. And yes, they are using overcapacity protocols. So if that's their culture, it's worth thinking about, well, like, what's the default culture? What's everyone else's culture? So remember when we sent that extra server home on Tuesday? I want to come back to that. So that's that common sense management, right? The efficiency of having the wards already full. Well, over time, I would argue what that does is it normalizes certain things. It normalizes having admitted patients in the ED. It normalizes the fact that we're always complaining about these admitted patients. Everybody comes to see the eMERGE as just a bunch of complainers. I mean, what do we really expect the eMERGE to be like? It's always like this. So it kind of normalizes a culture of access block. I believe that there are three pillars to changing the system. You've got to have the right leadership, the right hospital culture, and the right incentives in the system. So we need leaders who have the courage to change the model of care. We need to build a culture of accountability throughout the institution, and we need to change the incentives to deal with the moral hazard and the access block behavior. It's all very well to, of course, say this, but how do you actually operationalize it? Now, I know what you guys are thinking. Let's just move all the admits out of the eMERGE. Simple. Now it's someone else's problem. They're accountable. So I've thought about that, and even if it were possible, would it be the ideal solution? So the potential problem there is reverse moral hazard. So now we don't have any incentive to make difficult decisions about discharges. As soon as we decide to admit somebody, they're gone. It's someone else's problem. And of course, the consultants would probably respond to this by slowing down the admission process as much as they possibly could. Because as soon as they write that admission order, the patient's their problem. So I think to come up with the best system we can, given that we're stuck with this North American model, we need a little bit of Viccellio, we need a little bit of the UK 4-hour rule, we need some of what they have in North York, and another special ingredient I'm going to come to. So we're going to talk about some ways to reverse incentives and to supercharge flow. And at this point, I can't really cite evidence to support these proposals. Rather, these ideas are a synthesis of the available evidence, what we know about flow, economics, human psychology, but we're going one step into the unknown. Okay, wave admissions. What does that mean? You move admitted patients out of the eMERGE on a schedule. Could be 2 waves a day, could be 3, could be 1. 2 seems to make sense to me. For example, at TOH, each campus admits about 34 patients per day from the ED. So each wave would be about 17 patients. So at 8 in the morning, wave 1 goes up to the appropriate service line. Medicine patients to medicine, surgical patients to surgery. And it's their responsibility to cope. But patients can go to something called landing areas, which I'll come to in a moment. And then later in the day, you have wave 2. Now, you might think, well, what is this going to accomplish? Like, how is this any different from just moving them up when beds become available? By the wave. Well, remember, access block behavior is a kind of subconscious group behavior that is anti-flow. But when you have a wave, you can't block access. The wave comes on schedule. And in fact, once the patients are there, everything you do to increase flow benefits you. It decreases your workload. And you know that that next wave is going to be coming later in the day. Back in the eMERGE, we still have admitted patients. We haven't gotten rid of all of them. And we're still incentivized to reduce unnecessary admissions or consultations. But this last part is important. I am 100% sure that there are dozens of things that we could be doing on the inpatient level to improve flow. But when I talk to people who were working on this problem, they say it's really hard to sustain any of these improvements. We always sink back into our old ways of doing things because all of our incentives are anti-flow. If you change the incentive, you can unleash these ideas. Why the landing area? It's okay to have an intermediate step between the ED and the ward. If you have an intermediate area, that can help patients get to the right bed, which has benefits for flow down the line. You don't have the medicine patients halfway across the hospital on some other ward with nurses who aren't as experienced dealing with those patients. And you can design the landing area to be staffed. You can design and staff the landing area to accommodate the wave. So what is the landing area? Well, it could be like a medical assessment unit. It could be a 6-bed holding spot on a ward to take new arrivals. It could be the hallway. For some wards, it might just be the hallway. Now, what's the secret ingredient? I believe the secret ingredient is no more ambulance offload delay. When patients are stuck with the paramedics, that's just access block behavior by us. Unfortunately, the hospital and us, we really don't have any incentives to change, and we need political leadership here. There's many ways that this could be done. But I would propose, because I believe in economics, sort of a transactional model, a payment model, whereby after 30 minutes, the hospital's got to start paying the paramedics' wages. I think if you do that, you'll see pretty rapid change. Remember, these are patients we're going to be seeing anyway. We're not creating extra work for ourselves. This is a photo I took a few years ago. There were 22 paramedics sitting around waiting to offload their patients, and I talked to some of them, and I talked them into taking a photo. I could have been seeing those patients, right? For the last 2 or 3 years, I've been eating, drinking, sleeping, and dreaming crowding. I read everything I could. I talked to everyone who had experience and something to teach me, and I spent hours thinking and digesting all that information to try to understand this complex problem. And this is what I learned. Blaming patients for emergency department crowding is ridiculous. Capacity affects behavior, which affects flow, which affects capacity. Moral hazard provides powerful anti-flow incentives in our system. The North American model of emergency care promotes crowding. Just working harder will not get us anywhere. Rather, we need leadership, the right culture, and the right incentives, and it's probably better to pay for music. Thanks very much. I'll stop there and open it up for discussion.